Carl Jung said that everything that is not made conscious appears in our life as fate. Welcome to the shadow of marriage. There is a specific kind of pain that has no clean name. It is not the sharp, unmistakable pain of a betrayal you can point to. It is not the grief of a loss that everyone around you can see and acknowledge. It is something far more disorienting than either of those things. It is the pain of a woman who wakes up every morning inside a marriage that looks functional from the outside, that has a house, a routine, a social presence, a shared history, and who feels, with a consistency that has become impossible to explain away, that something is fundamentally wrong. Not with the marriage, not with him, with her, with the reliability of her own perception, with the trustworthiness of her own mind. In my years of clinical practice, working with women in various stages of marital crisis and emotional disconnection, I have sat across from this woman more times than I can count. She arrives at the consultation room not with anger. Anger would be easier. Anger has a direction. Anger points at something and demands accountability. She arrives with confusion, a deep, exhausting, years-long confusion that has settled into the architecture of how she experiences herself. And almost without exception, within the first few sessions, she says some version of the same thing. Maybe the problem is me. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I am asking for too much. Maybe I am imagining things that are not there. I want to say something clearly to every woman who has ever sat in that confusion, whether in a therapist's office or alone in a bathroom at 2 a.m, trying to make sense of why she feels so lost inside a life that is supposed to be working. You are not imagining things. You are not too sensitive. You are not crazy. What you are is a woman who has been living, for longer than you realize, inside a relationship that has been systematically teaching you to distrust yourself. And that teaching, that slow, consistent, devastatingly effective erosion of your own perceptual confidence, is one of the most serious forms of emotional harm that can happen inside a marriage. It has a clinical name. It is called gaslighting. And understanding it, truly, deeply, psychologically understanding what it is and how it works, is the beginning of everything. If you are watching this and something in those words landed somewhere real, I want you to stay with me through this entire video. Because what we are going to explore today is not surface-level relationship advice. It is a clinically grounded, psychologically precise examination of what happens to a woman's sense of self when she lives for years inside a marriage that makes her feel crazy, how it begins, what it costs, and what the path back to yourself actually looks like. If you are new to this channel, subscribe now and turn on notifications. This series goes somewhere most relationship content never reaches, and every video builds on the last. Let me tell you about a woman I will call Laura. Laura was 38 years old when she first came to see me. She was a university professor, literature specifically, a woman of precise language and careful thought, the kind of person who chose words deliberately and noticed when others didn't. She had been married for 11 years to a man I will call Marcus, successful lawyer, socially charming, the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately became its center of gravity, who remembered names and made people feel seen and told stories that everyone leaned toward. By every external measure, Laura's marriage looked like one of the good ones. By every internal measure, Laura was quietly falling apart. She could not tell me exactly what was wrong. And this, she noted herself, with the particular self-critical precision of someone who has spent years being told that her perceptions are unreliable, was probably more evidence that the problem was her. A woman who knows what she feels should be able to explain what she feels, she said. I cannot do that anymore. I spent our first several sessions doing very little other than listening, not interpreting, not offering frameworks or diagnoses or the structured clinical language that can sometimes arrive too early and feel like it is overriding the story rather than holding it. Just listening. And what emerged across those hours was a narrative that I had heard before. Not in its specific details, but in its essential architecture. The architecture of a woman who had learned, across 11 years of marriage, that her perception of reality was fundamentally not to be trusted. Not through a single dramatic event, not through one conversation she could point to as the moment everything shifted, but through something far more insidious than a single event, through the slow, patient, almost imperceptible accumulation of thousands of small moments in which her experience of what had happened was consistently, reliably, gently corrected by the person who was supposed to know her best. Carl Jung wrote extensively about what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves and our experience that we push into the unconscious because they are too uncomfortable, too threatening, too dissonant with the story we need to tell about our lives. And one of the most powerful insights of Jungian psychology is that the shadow does not disappear simply because we refuse to look at it. It goes underground. It operates from below. It shapes our behavior, our choices, our relationships, from a place where we cannot see it clearly enough to examine it. In Laura's marriage, the shadow was enormous, and it had been underground for a very long time. The first time Laura tried to describe to me what a typical conflict with Marcus looked like, she apologized 3 times before she finished the first sentence. "I want to be fair to him," she said. "I want to make sure I am describing this accurately, because I know I don't always get things right." I noticed the apologies. I noticed the self-qualification. I noticed that before she had even spoken a single word about her husband, she had already preemptively undermined the reliability of what she was about to say. This is what years of gaslighting does to a person. It does not just make them doubt specific perceptions in specific moments. It installs a permanent, generalized self-doubt that precedes every attempt to name their own experience. It makes a woman an unreliable narrator of her own life. What she described, once I assured her that I was not looking for fairness but for her experience, was this. When something happened between them that caused her pain, a comment that landed wrong, a dismissal that felt significant, a moment where she felt minimized or unseen, and she tried to address it, the conversation would follow a pattern so consistent and so precisely choreographed that she had stopped recognizing it as a pattern at all. It had simply become the texture of their communication. Marcus would listen, really listen, with the full, attentive presence of a man who was genuinely engaged, and then he would offer a correction. Not a defense, not a justification, a correction. A calm, reasonable, often quite compassionate reframing of what had actually happened. What she had heard was not what had been said. What she had felt was a response to a misreading. What she was experiencing as dismissal was actually his attempt to give her space. What she was experiencing as contempt was actually his frustration with a situation that had nothing to do with her. And he was sorry, genuinely sorry, that she had experienced it the way she had. But her experience, gently and consistently, and over again, was the variable. Her experience was the thing that kept being wrong. This is the clinical reality of gaslighting inside a marriage. And it is important that I describe it precisely because the word has been used so broadly in popular culture that it has lost some of its psychological specificity. Gaslighting is not simply lying. It is not simply manipulation in the general sense. It is a very particular form of psychological influence in which a person's subjective experience, their emotional responses, their perceptions, their memories, is consistently presented to them as inaccurate, distorted, or evidence of some deficit in themselves. Over time, this consistent presentation does something to the neurological and psychological architecture of the person receiving it. It literally changes how they process their own experience. It creates what researchers in trauma and attachment describe as a kind of perceptual learned helplessness, a state in which a person has been conditioned to believe that their own inner responses are not trustworthy guides to external reality. John Gottman's decades of research on couples identified contempt as the single most reliable predictor of relationship breakdown, more than conflict frequency, more than communication style, more than any other variable. And what Laura was experiencing, dressed in the language of calm and compassion and reasonable correction, was contempt in one of its most sophisticated forms. Not the contempt of eye rolls and sneering dismissal, the contempt of a man who had decided, at some level he may not have been fully conscious of, that his wife's inner life was less real, less reliable, and less important than his own interpretation of events. Maybe this is already landing somewhere real for you. Maybe you are watching this and recognizing a pattern, not necessarily identical to Laura's, because gaslighting does not have a single face. It wears whatever face is most effective in the specific relationship it operates within. But a pattern of being consistently told, in ways that feel reasonable and even caring, that what you experienced is not quite what you experienced, that you are reading things wrong, that you are too sensitive, that your emotional responses are disproportionate to what actually happened, that the problem is consistently, reliably, almost exclusively located in you. If that recognition is landing, if something in you is saying yes, this is the texture of my marriage, I want you to notice what happens in your body when you say yes to that. Because one of the most important things I have learned in clinical practice is that the body keeps a record that the mind often refuses to acknowledge. The tightening in the chest, the quality of exhaustion that is not physical, the specific flatness that follows a conversation in which you are gently told, again, that your experience of what happened was not accurate. These physiological responses are not overreactions. They are data. They are your nervous system registering, with extraordinary precision, information that your conscious mind has been trained to dismiss. There is a layer beneath this that almost no one identifies, even in therapy, even in the most honest conversations women have about their marriages. And it is the layer that, when you finally see it, changes the entire shape of the experience. Because the question that most people ask about gaslighting is, why does he do this? Is it conscious? Is it calculated? Is he a narcissist? Is he deliberately trying to undermine me? And these are understandable questions, but they are not actually the most important ones. The most important question, the one that opens the door to genuine understanding rather than simply to blame, is this: what is being protected by the consistent need to locate the problem in her experience rather than in his behavior? In my clinical work, I have encountered gaslighting behavior across a wide spectrum of men, from those who were operating with clear, almost strategic intentionality, to those who were genuinely, sincerely unaware that what they were doing could be described as harmful at all. What they had in common was not malice. What they had in common was a deep, largely unconscious terror of accountability, of being the one who had caused pain, of having their behavior examined and found wanting. Because genuine accountability, the willingness to say, I did something that hurt you, and I am responsible for that, requires a level of psychological security, a stable enough sense of one's own worth, that a person can acknowledge wrongdoing without experiencing it as a total collapse of their self-image. Men who gaslight their partners have almost universally not developed that security. They may be high-functioning in every other domain of life. They may be professionally successful, socially admired, capable of genuine warmth and connection in many contexts. But in the intimate space of the marriage, in the specific territory where their behavior is most visible and most vulnerable to examination, they do not have the internal resources to be accountable. And so, instead of accountability, there is correction. Instead of taking responsibility for the impact of their behavior, there is a gentle but consistent redirection of attention toward the inaccuracy of their partner's perception of that behavior. This is the shadow that Jung was describing when he wrote about the parts of ourselves we cannot bear to look at. Marcus had a shadow that he had been refusing to examine for his entire adult life. And Laura, by virtue of being his most intimate witness, was the person most likely to see it, and the most dangerous person, from the perspective of his unconscious self-protection, to allow to see it clearly. But there is something even more important to understand about why Laura stayed. Why she spent 11 years in a marriage that was systematically dismantling her self-trust. And why, when I ask this question in the clinical context, the answer is almost never what people expect. People expect the answer to be fear, or financial dependence, or the children, or the social cost of leaving. And sometimes it is those things, partly or wholly. But in Laura's case, and in the cases of so many women I have sat with in similar circumstances. The primary reason she stayed was something far more psychologically complex than external constraint. She stayed because she loved him. And she stayed because at the deepest level of her experience, she believed that if she could just find the right way to explain herself, if she could just finally make him understand what she was feeling, he would see it. He would get it. He would become the version of himself that she had glimpsed in the early years of the relationship, the version that had made her feel genuinely known, and the marriage would become what she had always believed it was capable of being. This is the hope that keeps women inside gaslighting relationships long past the point when every piece of clinical evidence is pointing toward the door. And it is not naive hope. It is not the hope of a woman who cannot see what is in front of her. It is the hope of a woman who can see clearly and loves deeply and has not yet been able to reconcile those two things, what she sees and what she feels, into a decision she can live with. If you are in that place right now, if you recognize Laura's hope as your own, if you are holding together what you see and what you feel and finding them almost impossible to reconcile, I want you to know that the work we do on this channel, and specifically in the ebook that accompanies it, was built for exactly this moment. Not for the woman who has already made her decision and needs support in leaving, but for the woman who is still in the middle of it, still trying to understand what is actually happening, still hoping that understanding will make a way through rather than only a way out. The ebook contains a structured framework for identifying gaslighting patterns in your own relationship, not in the abstract, but specifically, with clarity that allows you to see what you are actually dealing with rather than the version of it that has been presented to you. The link is in the description. I will come back to it. But right now, there is something even more important I need to show you. Because we have established what gaslighting is and how it operates. But we have not yet looked at what it does to a woman over time. What it actually costs. What it takes from her that she may not even realize has been taken until she is far enough outside the relationship to look back and see the shape of what was lost. What gaslighting costs a woman over time is not simply her confidence in specific situations or her trust in specific perceptions. What it costs her, at the deepest level of its damage, is her relationship with her own inner life, her ability to use her emotional responses as reliable information, her capacity to hear what her nervous system is telling her and to treat that information as real, as valid, as worth acting on. In clinical terms, we describe this as a disruption of what is called interoceptive awareness, the ability to accurately perceive and interpret signals from within your own body and emotional system. And when that ability is disrupted, when a person has been trained through years of consistent external correction to override their internal signals, the consequences extend far beyond the marriage itself. Laura described this to me in a way I have never forgotten. She said, "I used to know things. Not everything, not perfectly, but I used to have this quiet internal knowing about people, about situations, about when something felt right and when it didn't. It was reliable. I trusted it. And then somewhere in the middle of my marriage, I realized I had stopped consulting it. Not because I decided to, but because every time I followed it into a conversation with Marcus, the conversation ended with me doubting it. And eventually, it became easier to just not listen to it at all. This is what gaslighting does at its most fundamental level. It does not just create self-doubt. It creates a kind of internal silence, a shutting down of the interior voice that is, in Jungian terms, the voice of the self. Jung believed that one of the primary tasks of psychological development, what he called the process of individuation, was learning to hear and honor the voice of the authentic self, rather than the voices of external authority, social expectation, or what he called the persona, the mask we wear for the world. A woman who has been living inside a gaslighting relationship for years has had that process of individuation actively reversed. She has been trained to replace her authentic inner voice with an external authority, her husband's interpretation of her experience, until the authentic voice becomes so quiet she can no longer distinguish it from the noise. And here is what almost no one teaches about the recovery from this. The work of coming back to yourself after years of this kind of internal silence is not primarily the work of leaving the relationship, though leaving may ultimately be necessary. The work, the real, deep, unglamorous, sometimes terrifying work, is the work of learning to hear yourself again. Of sitting in the quiet and noticing what you actually feel, what you actually think, what your body is actually telling you, and choosing, repeatedly and against the grain of years of conditioning, to treat that information as real. This is not easy. And I want to be precise about why it is not easy, because the difficulty is not what most people assume it is. The difficulty is not the absence of the truth. The truth is always there, in the body, in the quiet moments before the rational mind has a chance to reframe it, in the dreams, in the things you find yourself thinking in the car alone or in the shower, or in the half-awake moments before sleep fully comes. The truth is not absent. The difficulty is the fear of the truth. Because the truth, once you stop reframing it, once you stop accepting the external correction and let yourself simply perceive what you perceive, is often more than the heart is immediately prepared to hold. For Laura, the truth arrived not in a dramatic confrontation or a discovered deception, but in a moment of profound, ordinary silence. She was sitting in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, reading, and Marcus was somewhere else in the house, and the quality of her relief at his absence was so unmistakable, so immediate, so entirely physical, that it stopped her mid-sentence in the book she was reading. She sat with that relief for a long time, not analyzing it, not immediately constructing a framework around it, just feeling it. The specific quality of ease that her body entered when he was not in the room. The specific quality of tension that she carried, she realized now, at all times when he was. Her body had known for years what her mind had been refusing to acknowledge. This is the clinical reality of what trauma researchers call somatic memory. The body's capacity to hold and communicate information that the conscious mind has learned to suppress. And it is one of the reasons that the path back to yourself after a gaslighting relationship must include the body, not just the intellect. You cannot think your way back to your own truth if the truth has been stored in places that thinking cannot reach. In the weeks that followed that Sunday morning, something began to shift in Laura that I can only describe as a very slow, very careful return to herself. Not a sudden transformation. Not the dramatic awakening that stories about leaving bad relationships tend to feature. Something quieter and more tentative than that. She began, for the first time in years, to let her emotional responses simply exist before she evaluated them. To notice what she felt without immediately moving to the question of whether she was right to feel it. To catch herself in the middle of the familiar internal process of self-correction. The reflexive reaching for Marcus's interpretation of her experience rather than her own. And to pause. To choose, just for that moment, to stay with what she actually felt before allowing the correction. This sounds simple. It is not simple. For a woman who has spent years having her inner experience consistently overridden, the act of trusting her own perception, even privately, even without consequence, even in a moment where no one else will ever know, can feel almost vertiginous, like standing at the edge of something without a railing, like choosing to believe the ground is solid before you have had confirmation that it is. But here is what I need you to understand about that vertiginous feeling. It is not a sign that you are making a mistake. It is a sign that you are doing something your nervous system has been conditioned to avoid. And the conditioning is the problem, not the response. The vertigo is not danger. The vertigo is the feeling of moving back toward yourself after a long time of being away. And it resolves, not immediately, not without sustained effort, but genuinely and progressively, as the self that you are returning to becomes more familiar again, as the inner voice that was trained into silence begins, slowly and haltingly at first, and then with increasing clarity and confidence, to speak again, I want to talk now about what the actual process of rebuilding self-trust looks like in practice. Because what I have described so far, the recognition of the pattern, the understanding of its psychological mechanisms, the beginning of the return to the self, is essential. But it exists at a level of description that can feel, without a practical framework, like understanding without traction, like knowing what needs to happen without knowing how to make it happen. The first concrete practice that I give to women who are in the process of recovering their self-trust after a gaslighting relationship is what I call the unedited record. It is exactly what it sounds like: a private, completely unedited written record of your immediate emotional responses to events in your marriage, made in real time, or as close to real time as possible, before the internal correction process has had a chance to run its course. Not a diary of what happened. A record of what you felt before you decided whether you were right to feel it. The purpose of this practice is not cathartic, though it can be. It is diagnostic. It is a tool for making visible the gap between your immediate emotional response and the corrected version of that response that you have been presenting to yourself and to your marriage as your authentic experience. And when you can see that gap, when you can hold the two versions side by side and observe the distance between them, something important happens. You begin to develop a felt sense of the correction process itself. You begin to recognize it as a process, something that happens to your experience rather than something that is your experience. And that recognition is enormously powerful because it introduces, for the first time, the possibility of choice, the possibility of noticing the correction beginning and deciding, in that moment, whether to allow it or to stay with what was there before it arrived. The second practice is what I call the body check-in. This is a brief, regular practice of turning attention inward, not to the contents of thought but to the physical state of the body, and asking a very simple question. What is my body telling me right now? Not what am I thinking? Not what does this mean? Not what should I do? What is my body telling me right now? And then simply listening to whatever arises, the tension, the ease, the constriction, the opening, the heaviness, the lightness, without immediately translating it into narrative or moving to evaluate whether the response is appropriate. This practice is grounded in the neuroscience of interoception and in the clinical work of researchers like Bessel van der Kolk, whose work on trauma and the body has transformed our understanding of how psychological harm is stored and how recovery actually works. The body is not a passive receiver of the mind's decisions. It is an active participant in the process of knowing, and a remarkably reliable one, particularly for information that the conscious mind has been trained to override. Learning to consult it is not a spiritual practice, though it can become one. It is a clinical one. It is the practice of restoring access to a channel of information that has been systematically jammed. The third practice is what I describe as the authority inventory. This is a structured process of identifying the specific ways in which external authority, specifically your partner's interpretation of your experience, has been substituted for your own. It involves going back through specific memories of moments when you felt your experience was corrected and asking, for each one, what did I actually feel before the correction? What did I tell myself I should feel after it? And what do I believe right now, with the perspective of time and distance, was closer to an accurate read of the situation? This practice is not about building a case against your partner. I want to be clear about that, because the authority inventory can feel like prosecution, and that is not its purpose. Its purpose is restoration. The restoration of your own authority over your own inner life. The restoration of the sense that your perceptions and your emotional responses are real, are valid, are worth consulting, not infallible. No one's perceptions are infallible, and part of genuine psychological health is the ability to update your perceptions in light of new information. But real. Yours. Worth taking seriously before someone else's interpretation of them is allowed to override them. Laura did all three of these practices across the months of our work together. Not consistently, not perfectly, not without the regressions and the periods of doubt, and the nights where the familiar self-diminishment returned with all its old force, but persistently, And what changed over those months was not dramatic in the way that transformation is often portrayed. It was something quieter and more durable than drama. It was the gradual return of a woman to her own company, the gradual restoration of a voice that had been trained into silence, the gradual rebuilding of a relationship with herself that had been, for 11 years, systematically undermined by the person she had chosen to trust most. And then came the conversation. Not a confrontation. She was not ready for a confrontation. And I want to be honest about the fact that not every story of gaslighting ends with a confrontation, and the absence of one is not a failure of courage. What came was something more precise than a confrontation. It was a moment of clarity so complete that it required, in its fullness, to be spoken out loud. She waited until the children were at her mother's house. She sat down across from Marcus at the kitchen table, the same kitchen where she had sat alone on that Sunday morning with her relief and her reckoning. And she said, in a voice that she described to me afterward as the steadiest she had used in years, "I need to tell you something. Not to argue about it, not to get you to agree with it. Just to say it, out loud, to you. Because I have been not saying it for a very long time, and the not saying it has cost me more than I can fully explain." And then she said, "I do not trust my own mind inside this marriage. And I have come to understand that the reason I do not trust my own mind is not that my mind is untrustworthy. It is that I have been consistently told, for years, that my experience of things is wrong. And I am not willing to keep agreeing with that. Not because I am certain that my experience is always right, but because I am certain that I am the only one who has the right to be the primary authority on it." Marcus did not respond the way she had feared. He did not dismiss her. He did not immediately move to correct her. He sat very still for a long time. And then he said something she had not expected. He said, "I think I knew. I think I knew. And I didn't know how to stop." This is not every story. I want to be honest about that. Some of the women I have worked with have had this conversation and received exactly the correction they expected, the calm, compassionate, carefully constructed reframing that told them, one more time, that what they were experiencing was not what they thought it was. And for those women, the conversation was not the beginning of the marriage's repair. It was the confirmation that the repair was not possible with the marriage as it existed. And that confirmation, as painful as it was also a form of clarity. And clarity, even when it is devastating, is always more useful than confusion. For Laura, the conversation was the beginning of something, not the immediate repair of 11 years of accumulated damage. That does not happen in a single conversation, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. But the beginning of a different kind of honesty between them. The beginning of a process that was difficult and uncertain and is still ongoing, in which Marcus has been confronting his own shadow, the parts of himself he has spent his life refusing to examine. And Laura has been slowly, carefully, with full knowledge of the risk involved, learning to trust herself again inside the marriage rather than only outside of it. This process, this dual work of one person confronting their shadow and another person rebuilding their self-trust, is the most complex and the most demanding work that a marriage can undertake. It requires more than goodwill. It requires more than the desire to repair. It requires specific, structured, clinically grounded guidance for both people, and it requires the willingness to stay in the discomfort of genuine change rather than retreating to the familiar relief of old patterns. This is precisely what the ebook was designed to support. It contains the 3 practices I described today: the unedited record, the body check-in, and the authority inventory, in detailed guided form, with specific instructions for each stage of the process. It contains a framework for the conversation that Laura had, the conversation that names what has been happening without performing it as an accusation, with specific language structures that make it possible to speak the truth without triggering the defensiveness that shuts the conversation down before it has a chance to do anything. And it contains a section specifically for the partner who is ready to hear, who has said, as Marcus did, "I think I knew." and who needs a structured path for confronting their own shadow and building the accountability that genuine repair requires. The link is in the description below. If you have been watching this video and recognizing your marriage in Laura's story, if the confusion, the self-doubt, the exhaustion of not trusting your own mind is a landscape you have been living in, I want you to take the next step. Not because the ebook will do the work for you, but because the work is real work, and real work goes further with real structure. As we come to the end of this video, I want to leave you with something that I hope will stay with you. Jung believed that the shadow, everything we refuse to look at in ourselves and in our lives, does not become less powerful because we refuse to look at it. It becomes more powerful. It operates from the dark. It shapes our choices, our relationships, our sense of ourselves, from a place where we cannot examine it, or challenge it, or transform it. And the only thing that diminishes the shadow's power is light. The light of honest, courageous, unflinching attention. You are not crazy. What you have been feeling is real. What your body has been telling you is real. The voice that has been trained into silence inside you is real, and it is still there, and it is still telling the truth, and it deserves to be heard. By you, first and most importantly, before anyone else. The confusion you have been living in is not a permanent state. It is the result of a process. And processes that were created can be reversed. Not easily, not quickly, but genuinely and with lasting effect when the right understanding meets the right tools in the hands of a person who has decided that they are done agreeing with the version of themselves that was constructed for someone else's comfort. You are not that version. You never were. And the work of coming back to who you actually are, the steady, sometimes painful, ultimately liberating work of recovering the self that was trained into silence, is the most important work you will ever do. Not for your marriage, not for him, for yourself. And from that self, from that recovered ground, every other decision, whether to stay or to go, whether to repair or to release, becomes possible to make with the clarity and the dignity that you have always deserved. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. This conversation continues, and every video in this series takes you deeper into the territory of what it actually means to know yourself, honor yourself, and build a life that is grounded in your own truth rather than in someone else's version of it. The ebook is in the description. Your story does not have to continue the way it has been going. The shadow has been running your life long enough. It is time to bring it into the light. Welcome to the shadow of marriage, and welcome back to yourself.